I decided to do an examination of Title IX. So for my introduction, I know we kind of discussed about what Title IX was, but I wanted to dig deeper and talk about the creation of Title IX and history on it. I want to compare and contrast an advantage and a disadvantage. Then I have two examples of case studies that I found to be very interesting, and then my short conclusion. So just to briefly talk about the history, President Lyndon Johnson kind of decided that federally funded contracts needed to have an executive order because I guess during this period of time that discrimination had been on the rise. And so Lyndon Johnson kind of started the act of, or the law of Title IX and as to why it should be passed. So that was in 1967. 2 years later, Bernie Sandler kind of, I feel like, paved the way for Title IX to officially become a law because she was a professor at the University of Maryland. She was not full-time. She was part-time, and her tenure, I guess, was almost up. And in order for her to continue, she wanted to be full-time tenure instead of part-time. So this law of Title IX that was created 3 years later and signed as a law by President Nixon allowed her to fulfill her, I guess, success and duty of being a full-time professor at the University of Maryland. And then I'm going to paraphrase kind of what Title IX really means. It is whether you're male or female, you should not be discriminated towards against based on you need to be able to have the benefits that everybody else has under any educational program or activity, whether it's sports or school, from a place that is receiving financial federal assistance, which is basically money from the government. So with that being said, here are some advantages and disadvantages. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I wanted to point out how it created more opportunities for women's sports and female athletes are connected. So with that being said, the female athletes have not benefited because they're very underrepresented, or not underrepresented, not very followed in the media. If you kind of look at ESPN, just for an example, or SportsCenter, women really aren't talked about a whole lot, and especially the athletes. The athletes don't get the same benefits as men. I'm going to kind of use an example is the men's basketball team gets flown everywhere. They get flown to Louisville for heaven's sake, and the women have to drive. So when they don't get to play at Rupp Arena as well. That's kind of why they haven't benefited, even though their program has not built up the reputation, but they have not benefited from the standpoint that they have not received equal pay. If you think about female sports and athletes, like Sabrina Ionescu might not make as much as maybe say LeBron James, even though she's not been in the WNBA that long, that's still a comparison. When you talk about more opportunities, 2012 Olympics is a great example. More women won medals and represented more than men. And then another example is how the 1990s, that era of women's U.S. soccer team, paved the way for why they should get paid more. So those are two really good examples. And the two Title IX case studies I want to talk about was the Cannon versus the University of Chicago, where she was over 30 and didn't get accepted into Northwestern University and the University of Chicago because she was over 30. These two colleges were private, but were funding funding from the government, like scholarships and stuff. So she won in 7-2, and so she got to be able to go into the schools because she was over 30. She wanted to be a housewife. So, and then the Franklin versus the public county schools, the young lady was a sophomore. Her coach / teacher sexually harassed her, physically, with intercourse, kissing, explicit comments, and the school at first dropped it, as well as the federal district court, which is wrong on so many levels. So she felt like she had a case and had to bring it to the Supreme Court, which was unanimously 9-0. She deserves money because this has caused so much of a burden and stress and has really hindered on her health. So that's why she should have received money, and she did. So she sued not probably only the school, but the gentleman as well. And then here are some conclusions I wanted to just reiterate. Kind of what I talked about was the creation of Title IX and the history on it, with it starting out as an executive order from Lyndon Johnson to where Bernie Sandler kind of paved the way. And then there's two advantages the advantage and the disadvantage is kind of how women have not benefited, but have also kind of paved the way for more women. And then those two cases that I really think stood out to me, because Title IX is very important to have, especially with today's day and age and a lot of discrimination going on. You probably see more cases of it now, but aren't as represented. And then here is a copy of my references, and I hope you enjoyed my